Tom DiLorenzo is professor of economics at Loyola College in Maryland and a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, of course, another organization that has stood steadfast in favor of liberty and limited government since 9/11 and, of course, before. A frequent contributor to LouRockwell.com, Tom's 10 books that he has authored or co-authored cover such subjects as antitrust, politics, interventionism, and the Civil War. His talk today, Why Enemies of Liberty Love Lincoln, is based on his book, Lincoln Unmasked, What You're Not Supposed to Know About Dishonest Abe. Tom DiLorenzo.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank, what's your name, Jacob? I heard someone call you that this morning for the first time for inviting me. And yeah, my topic, why enemies of liberty love Lincoln. I wouldn't say all enemies of liberty, but seems to be most. And to understand this, I think I'll start by paraphrasing something David Donald said. David Donald is the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Lincoln. He retired from Harvard a couple of years ago. And he's my favorite mainstream author on Lincoln. The rest I don't really care for much, but David Donald is a pretty straight shooter. And he remarked in one of his books that after Lincoln's death, every political party almost of any kind began trying to attach themselves and their agenda, whatever it was, to Lincoln's martyrdom. He also mentioned that during his own lifetime, Lincoln was not very well liked. And you could imagine that. After all, he did imprison tens of thousands of northern civilians during the war and instituted conscription and so forth. So he was not well liked and even despised by his own people during his lifetime. It was after his death that he was turned into a saint. And so it's not unusual. David Donald mentioned that even the Communist Party USA used to hold Lincoln Lenin Day rallies in New York City and had gigantic pictures of Lincoln and Lenin in their offices there. And so it's not just the enemies of liberty who love Lincoln, it's politicians of all kinds, but I would argue especially the enemies of liberty. And why is that? Well, one of the things you have to keep in mind about Lincoln, I think, is that on the day he was inaugurated, he very clearly announced his intentions, and in the weeks to follow, he announced his reasons for the war. Once the war came, as did the United States Congress, and of course the reasons that he gave were saving the Union. And in his first inaugural address, which any of you can read online, he endorsed something that was known then as the Corwin Amendment to the Constitution. It had been already passed the House and the Senate, and this amendment would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering in Southern slavery. And Lincoln, his exact words in his first inaugural address were, he said that, I understand, he said his belief is that it is already constitutional, that slavery is already constitutional, he said, but that he had no objection to making it, quote, express and irrevocable. And not only did he endorse this amendment to make slavery last forever, as far as his whole lifetime, but he actually orchestrated the amendment. The plagiarist Doris Kearns Goodwin mentions this in her book. She wrote a big 1,000-page book on Lincoln last year called Team of Rivals, and she praises him for this amendment because it was such a slick political maneuver. I guess to people like that, slick political maneuvering is all that counts. But she tells the story that I've known about, but if any of you, most of you have never heard of because you went to public school, or if you went to private school, your teachers were trained by public school, so of course you never heard of this. But she tells the story that historians all know, that after Lincoln was elected, but before he was inaugurated, he instructed William Seward to get this through the Congress, through the Senate. And which he did. He got this Corwin Amendment through the Senate, and so Lincoln was actually the string puller. He was actually the originator of this amendment. Not only did he endorse it in his first inaugural, but it was all his doing. But in that same first inaugural address, though, as I argue in my latest book, if you read his words, he literally threatened a military invasion over tax collection. He said, it's my duty to collect the imposts and duties, but beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state. And so in terms of slavery, he was willing to see it last long beyond his own lifetime. But with regard to secession, which meant no more federal taxes being paid by the southern states, he literally threatened war. And of course, once the war began, that was the official reason that he and the Congress gave for the war, was saving the Union. And of course, saving the Union is kind of a nice phrase, but I have made the case in a lot of my writings that saving tax collection was really the heart of the matter there, because the Republican Party had plans for imperial glory as a form of government. That's what the government would pursue, imperial glory. And so saving the Union, I think of Lincoln as the most masterful politician in all of American history, Bill Clinton times 10,000, if you will. That's how I think of Lincoln as a politician. And so when he said saving the Union, what he really meant was destroying the Union, but he pulled it off. And of course, the Union was voluntary. The citizens of the states held political conventions and decided to join or not to join. And when Rhode Island and North Carolina dragged their feet for quite a long time, there was no talk of invading them and killing 1 out of 4 men of military age and burning down their cities and all that sort of thing. None of that was talked about. It was voluntary, and Rhode Island and North Carolina, if they wanted to maintain their own separate countries, they were allowed to. In fact, the Constitution would never have been ratified, I don't think, by any state if it was the understanding that it was a one-way Venus flytrap from which there would never be any escape. Try to escape and we will kill you by the hundreds of thousands. It wouldn't have been ratified by a single state. But that was Lincoln's understanding of the Constitution, though. It was, yes, we can kill you if you leave the voluntary Union. And so in my writings, I conclude that he destroyed the Union. The Union was voluntary. And more than that, what was really destroyed was the Jeffersonian view of the Constitution. And in its place came the Hamiltonian view of the Constitution. And since the last speaker gave a plug for his next book, I'll plug my next book. It's called Hamilton's Curse. It's all about why Jefferson was right to hate and despise Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's view of the Constitution, well, he laid his cards on the table when he attended the Constitutional Convention, which was he lobbied for more than anybody for 7 years. And he wanted a permanent president, AKA King, who would appoint all the governors and who would have veto power over all state legislation that was passed by the states, so that the states would have essentially become defunct politically. All political power would have been centralized in the executive branch of the federal government. Not only the federal government, but the executive branch of the federal government. That was the Hamiltonian Constitution. It was Hamilton who invented the notion of implied powers of the Constitution, even resultant powers. His argument was, if the government were to do something that was clearly unconstitutional, like invade Canada in an aggressive war, for example, by using all the existing powers of government to achieve that, the conquest of Canada, it would create new resultant powers of the government. Without a constitutional convention, without amending the Constitution, these powers become real. And so, and this all sounds very much like what happened during the Lincoln regime. And so, that's my take on it, is that the Jeffersonian view of the Constitution was very, very different, of course. And I think the hallmark of the Jeffersonian view, which prevailed more or less until the 1860s, was that if the citizens were to be the masters rather than servants of their own government, the only way that could really be achieved is if they could control this government somehow through political communities organized at the state and local levels of government. Madison called it divided sovereignty. But if this was going to work, if this Constitution was going to work, how is it going to be enforced? We can't just announce that we have a Constitution and rely on government to enforce it. It's limits on itself. The Jeffersonians always argued that if the day ever came when the central government became the sole arbiter of the limits of its own power, then pretty soon it would decide there are no limits on our power.